So good morning, everyone, and welcome to our seminar on cultural revitalization. This is the second in a series of seminars on Scotland's role and contribution in a changing Arctic environment. My name is, if this advances, my name is David Anderson, and I'm a professor of anthropology at the University of Aberdeen. I'll be chairing this session, and we have four panelists, after which we'll have a discussion about Scotland's role in the Arctic. So the outline today is that Dr. Peter Louvers, project curator of the British Museum exhibit Arctic Culture and Climate and honorary research fellow, will present, followed by Dr. Tamara Ranspot, a teaching fellow in the anthropology department and a long-term researcher in the Canadian Arctic, Professor Peter Reid, professor of librarianship at Robert Gordon University, and Professor Donna Heddle, director of the Institute for Northern Studies at the University of Highlands and Islands and member of the UArctic thematic network on circumpolar archives, which she'll be presenting. So I will give a short introduction to the theme of cultural revitalization. This will be followed by several 8-minute presentations by each of our guest speakers. After this, we have breakout rooms or time for facilitated discussion with some questions. Since I'm sitting in my vehicle, if my battery lasts, I'll facilitate that. If not, Senan will facilitate it. And then we'll come back for a conclusion. So I apologize for the setting. It's just that balancing homeschooling and whatnot, I've chosen this as my soundproof video studio in order to do this this presentation. So what I'll do is I'll start my presentation on cultural revitalization. Cultural revitalization is a blanket term that I'm giving to this idea that we can use the histories of colonialism and the histories of our relationships around the world in order to revive cultures and introduce new richness and new insights into northern and circumpolar cultures. There's often a discourse about culture loss, language loss in the highlands, language loss across the north, and this feeds into this idea of there being peripheries on certain centers, and that there are dominant global languages and that there's dominant global cultures, and in the periphery, people just experience a form of loss. What I'd like to do is present a different idea. Historically, many of these cases that are now viewed from the metropolitan centers as peripheries were once centers. And indeed, Scotland was and will be a center of Arctic research and Arctic exploration. The movement between center and periphery is a historical one. And so by trying to understand the strengths and the richness of cultures in different areas, we can understand the way in which Arctic cultures and Arctic relationships can be strong again. So I'm putting forth this idea of moving beyond cultural loss, of trying to think of this idea of what skills and what information we have that can lead to cultural revitalization. And so I want to spend my 10 minutes by giving a few examples that will hopefully spark some discussion and debate with our panelists and also with all of you who have joined us here today. I'm going to look at three particular themes: artifacts, repatriation of artifacts, and digital sharing. Then I'm going to talk about enskillment. And finally, I'm going to talk about renewed relationships and global citizenship and the way that Scottish institutions can play a powerful role in this. So to begin with artifacts, repatriation, and digital sharing. What I'd like to do is talk about the material legacies of colonialism in Scotland and how these link to the circumpolar world. And I'm going to be doing this through a number of examples. A lot of the examples that I'm presenting are examples from the University of Aberdeen, both from my research and the research of colleagues within other departments. This isn't to say that there aren't other examples around Scotland. It's just that putting together the presentation, these were the images that I found easiest to access for this short presentation. There are a number of different ways that we can look at material legacies. We have archives of photographs, glass plate negatives. Many of us took part in a large project in order to digitize glass plate negatives and distribute them to communities around the world. In this case, a Yurak shaman from the Yenisei River Delta in Syria was part of a project funded by the ESRC whereby these fragile images were digitized and then put onto websites and sent around the world. A number of my colleagues in the archaeology department are working on a site in Alaska where climate change and global warming has led to the melting out of the permafrost and the exposure of these rare Aluic artifacts. And so they are engaged in a race against time to preserve these artifacts, curate them, and then reassemble them and share them with the communities. One of my colleagues within the department, bringing this close to home, has worked very closely with the hill fort and monument around Benehi, a mountain just outside of Aberdeen. They've created a digital app which allows school children and tourists to see the legacies of this particular community and understand the relationships to that community. So this idea of looking at material legacies and the items that we hold in Scotland is about the recovery and curation of artifacts, the way that we can use digital technologies in order to share images of these artifacts with communities around the North, and that there are a number of different ways that we can work with this. So I presented a little bit of the idea of scanning glass plate negatives and putting them on internet online access. What I'll talk about in a minute is a new technology of doing three-dimensional scanning and three-dimensional printing, which creates proxies of artifacts that are held within museums that can then be reintroduced to communities and used in everyday life, thereby creating a new way of understanding the culture and the relationships of these artifacts. So this is what I'll call enskillment, and this is working together with communities to revive skills. And this goes beyond just taking artifacts and bringing them back to communities, but starts a new conversation of reintroducing ideas, legends, languages into a community so that they can live and breathe again within those particular places. In this particular slide, although it's hard to see, Nenets, reindeer herders in Yamal Peninsula are looking at 3D printed artifacts. They're on the you could probably see them just a little bit on the table here, plastic reproductions of reindeer harness pieces that come from 1,000 years ago. And these contemporary reindeer herders are trying to study these pieces, tell the ethnoarchaeologists how they might use them, and actually can put them on to contemporary reindeer and see how they would work within a modern setting. These slides show an interesting project that we were engaged in with the Prince of Wales Northern Heritage Museum in the Northwest Territories of measuring a tent covering that was held within an American museum that was taken from the community about 100 years ago, and then working with local seamstresses in order to make a new copy of that. In order to recover the technology of how to sew these skins together, we took the seamstresses to Eastern Siberia, where people still live in conical tents, and looked at the way and the stitching that they use there, and used this cross-pollinization of knowledge in order to create a new tent that Clichat in the Northwest Territories are still using. My colleague Nancy Walkowicz is working with sealskin and sealskin artifacts in Northern Canada, and also reviving the skills of working with sealskin in order to make clothing. Finally, in terms of renewing relationships, this detailed study and exchange of techniques leads to new conversations and new ways to join Scottish scholars, Scottish institutions, Scottish museums and archives to source communities, and new ways of getting more information from these source communities. So through this this exchange, stories and artifacts become used within everyday life, become part of everyday ceremonies, become part of the strength of these communities to renew other things such as revitalizing language and culture, renewed public awareness and respect for indigenous cultures and local cultures and rural cultures, and understanding how these particular cultures can contribute to a vibrant circumpolar landscape. And finally, this idea of global citizenship, that Scotland and Scottish researchers are using their artifacts, their skills, their ethno-historical and archaeological insights in order to bring about a revival of culture in different places around the world and start a renewed exchange between people. Just to conclude, this map, which we're using in our ref impact sort of statements, shows the places where some of our projects within the anthropology project department have been done, and it shows the range of relationships across one aspect of the one part of the circumpolar north to the other. So with that very brief introduction about cultural revitalization, I'd like to turn the floor over to our panelists. So I guess I wasn't planning that slide. I apologize for that. So I'll call on Dr. Peter Louvers in order to give his presentation on Arctic culture and climate. Should I stop sharing my screen, I guess?
Okay, sorry, I'm just trying to figure out how to get back onto the.
Okay, we can hear you, Peter. Would it help if I didn't share my screen?
Yeah.
Okay. I guess Senna did that for me. I'll turn off my video if I know how to do this.
And then I go.
Okay. So you probably have to go to the bottom left to turn on your video. There we go. We're looking at your notes right now.
No, that's sorry.
It's okay.
I will try one more time. Sorry, guys. It's I'm also not that. Yeah. Okay. So good morning and thank you, David and Sanan, for the invitation. So allow me also to acknowledge my Christian teachers. In this presentation, I will briefly speak about the recent Arctic Culture and Climate exhibition at the British Museum, and that just closed last Sunday, for which I was the project curator alongside Dr. Amber Lincoln as lead curator and a much wider team. I will then turn briefly to dogs and fish. I will conclude with placing cultural revitalization in light of climate change and climate justice. The exhibition was envisioned by curator of the Americas, Dr. Jacob Cooper, and Dr. Amber Lincoln. Like my own experience with indigenous peoples across the globe, Amber has worked extensively with indigenous peoples. These experiences guided us in bringing the Arctic to London through various collaborations with indigenous communities, institutions, and individuals. And to them, we express our gratitude. The exhibition addresses climate change through the lens of weather. Following Tim Ingold, we understand climate as an abstraction generated in models that can be measured, whereas weather is a lived experience. Weather, as our Arctic indigenous teachers and collaborators have emphasized, is essential in the Arctic for traveling, building, food, materials, and ceremonies. So where does climate come into play? Arctic Culture and Climate addresses climate change in a more nuanced way through the focus on weather, as I mentioned, and climate change and climate shifts. Arctic indigenous peoples, for over 32,000 years, have been coping with climate and have made hospitable homelands out of ecosystems of ice. Natural climate shifts, taking hundreds if not thousands of years, led to the receding Barentsia landmass and rising sea levels. Human-induced climate change, however, has been much more recent and rapid. And by the way, the center one is this is where David was talking about the nanite. Anyways, within a generation, Arctic indigenous people have experienced drastic changes in seasonal patterns with erratic weather. Subsequently, weather has become more unpredictable with devastating impact on their lives. Nonetheless, as we have shown in the exhibition, Arctic indigenous peoples have used 4 similar strategies throughout history to combat change, namely adaptation or anticipation, collaboration, resistance, and innovation. They have done this through ingenious technologies, which are plentiful to be found in the exhibition. This has also become apparent when thinking about revitalization. In the exhibition, we wanted to leave the visitor with a positive message and press something different than one might expect. So we deliberately left out the polar bears on floating ice. The message is that of hope, and to let the visitor ponder how they could incorporate Arctic people's strategies into their own lives, as well as think of ideas for sustainable living to reverse climate change. Embassy of Imagination, one of our indigenous collaborators, sums this up excellently. Their installation, Atichit Silapat, made of Japanese paper parkas by children from two communities in Nunavut, northern Canada, at the end of the exhibition, is a testimony to hope and the crucial importance of the future generations. Taking children out on the land, engaging with materials as their elders have done, and learning new techniques are paramount in maintaining and revitalizing practices. And here I deliberately place an emphasis on and vitalization. It is the vitalization of relations with others that is crucial. Quitchen too have been concerned with climate change. In a blog for the exhibition entitled Dogs in the Arctic, I spoke with Abram Stewart Jr. and his son Richard. I had already spoken with Abram for the ERCC Arctic Domus project, which David was the lead investigator for, in which I worked with Quitchen on their lives with dogs. So this is what Abram said about the importance of dog teams. We can use dog team to go out on the land, to get wood, to hunt caribou, to go fishing. We use dog team for everything. That is one of the reasons to start a dog team again. We have one dog where we will get pups from. My son Richard is very interested in driving a dog team. The last time I had a dog team was 1980. Then I went to work, and from that time on, we started to have this global warming. I remember that. I'm still living out on the land, and the way things are going globally, it sure don't look too healthy for me. Not only me, but some old people talk about it. They say hard times are coming again. Even way back in the 1960s and 70s, I remember our elders telling us that someday you guys are going to have hard times, you young people. That is something which is happening now. So I talk to my boys about stuff like that and telling them that we need to go back and try getting a dog team because it will not be easy to find gas for snowmobiles or trucks. From the 1980s back, I never seen any change in the weather. I remember because May 1980 was the last time I went out on the land with an elder, and everything was normal according to the weather. Right from the start of summer in July, we go out on the land and start fishing in order to make dry fish for the winter to feed the dogs. The weather is just the right weather. It's not too hot nor too cold to dry fish. It rains whenever it has to rain. The sun shines when it has to shine. Then into fall, autumn, the lakes and rivers start freezing up by mid-September with ice. All that time we are fishing. The weather allows us what normally to do during the seasons without interruption. But now, due to global warming, it only starts freezing up late September into October. And then there's still a lot of ice. In December, there are still small creeks that are running with water. The warmer weather also affects fishing. When I caught fish, it would immediately freeze, and so it does not spoil. But now, when I'm fishing to dogs for the winter food, the fish just get spoiled and I have to throw them away. It's too warm. Now, these are big changes. Also, when it comes to teaching my children. When I am out on the land, I need to know whether the ice is safe or when to hunt. The fish and caribou, too, are all on a different time, in a different time zone now. It is hard to teach anybody about the safety on the land because so much has changed globally. Richard, Abe's son, agrees and told me, with all these changes and the things my father is telling me, I would not mind to start having a dog team. One time I went for wood with a snowmobile and I broke down with the snowmobile. We had a couple of pups from one of my dad's dogs at my dad's cabin. I walked back to our cabin and hooked up those pups to the dog sled with old-time harness, and they pulled that wood out. That's what my father means with relying on, being reliable. I always listen to my elders when they talk about their travels with dog teams. I guess you get to see more of the country than with snowmobile. So I was always thinking of having a dog team too. I always wanted to. Now, so this brings me to the conclusion. Cultural revitalization has mostly been discussed in bringing back uh, so-called forgotten knowledge and skills. And David was already alluding to that have become nearly lost or scarce due to colonial practices in indigenous lands and lives. Certainly, the examples that I provided here are addressing colonial histories. Yet, here I also want to argue that climate change needs to be brought back into the equation. Hence, when we speak about revitalization, it implies the return of vitality of the land. With climate change, such a vitality is under threat. Air, water, and land pollution due to resource extraction projects and non-sustainable industrial enterprises directly affect revitalization initiatives. Changing weather patterns, as Abram mentioned, have dire consequences for these initiatives. Furthermore, dogs, like indigenous peoples, rely on healthy fish and other animals for food. Thus, revitalization initiatives subsequently immediately are also a call for climate justice. They concern the rights for healthy seas, land, rivers to ensure the well-being of indigenous communities in the generations to come. They concern social and political action, or to conclude with the Embassy of Imagination, they are calling for reciprocal global action in solidarity during this time of transformation. Perhaps one can consider this as a revitalization in the Arctic and elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you
Okay.
so much, Peter.
Stop sharing screen.
So the next panelist will be Dr. Tamara Ranspot. So I'll invite Tamara up.
Thanks, David. I'm just gonna make my attempt at the screen sharing. Can you see that okay? Can someone give me a yes?
Yes, it looks good.
Okay, perfect, thank you. Well, good morning, and thanks very much, Peter, for that presentation. Today, I would like to speak briefly about my own experience as a researcher engaging with local movements of cultural revitalization in a small northern community, and just sharing some of my sort of reflections and stories that I hope might illuminate the possibilities for us as researchers. So I conducted my doctoral fieldwork in Dawson City in the Yukon, which is actually about as close as you can get to the Arctic whilst technically being subarctic. So it's a small town just south of the Arctic Circle, bordering on Alaska in Northwest Canada. And it's home to the Chontaquichin First Nation. And those who've heard of Dawson City have likely done so because it was the center of the Klondike Gold Rush of the late 19th century. So my research was also part of the Arctic Domus project, and it was examining the role of music in human-animal relations. So I spent a year in and around Dawson working with the Chontaquichin Heritage Department and having the great privilege of getting to know and spend time with a lot of Chontaquichin citizens. So one particular aspect of the research that emerged during my fieldwork is the story of the Han songs. And this is a story that I'd like to share today, sort of with a view to the notion that research that focuses on musical practices in the Arctic and the place of musical practices in movements of cultural revitalization can help to tell a different story about colonialism and disruption in the North. A story that highlights the agency and the resilience of Arctic communities, sort of moving beyond this idea of a cultural loss, as David mentioned in his introduction. So this particular story is much longer and more complex than I have the time to do justice to today. But in brief, following this massive influx of newcomers to the territory in the 19th century, gold stampeders, missionaries, and government officials who were looking to demarcate that national border between the Yukon and Alaska. This border was finally established in 1903. And the significant impact that newcomers were having on Chontakwitchin and their land was compounded by this border. So all of a sudden, Chontakwitchin found their traditional territory bisected, which was limiting their seasonal subsistence movements and fracturing kinship ties. And so people were suddenly faced with this dilemma of having to choose to settle either on the Canadian or the American side of this new border. So there are several versions of the story, but as it's often told, Chontakwitchin Chief Isaac, saw the tremendous impact that this influx of people was having. So not only was their land being ripped open, but federal statutes had been imposed that were disrupting cultural practices. For example, potlatch was banned, and several elders told me stories about drums being burnt in the region. And Chontakwitchin have long been recognized by their neighbors and in academic literature for their prowess as singers and dancers. But these violent colonial forces were threatening to disrupt this. So sometime around 1912, Chief Isaac was invited by Alaskan kin to a potlatch in Alaska. And he took all of his people's songs and dances, which are referred to as the Han songs. And there he left them for safekeeping with the understanding that one day they would be returned. So this was a temporary measure undertaken by the community to protect their songs until such a time that they had weathered the storm of newcomers and were ready for their songs to come home. So these songs and dances remained in Alaska, forgotten by many throughout the 20th century, which was a dark time for Chontakwitchin. The residential school system run by the Anglican Church took Chontakwitchin children from their homes and sent them to residential schools hundreds of kilometers away, where they were forbidden from speaking their language or engaging in any displays of their home culture. And the traumas of these schools held long after the children left, which ensured that one of the most damaging legacies among many is this sort of profound stigma and sense of shame when it came to Chontakwitchin culture and language. And this, coupled with over a century of other invasive policies and institutions, decimated the Han language such that by the early 1990s, it was and continues to be critically endangered. But in the early 1990s, we saw the beginnings of efforts to revitalize the Han language. And as part of these early revitalization endeavors, a group of Chontakwitchin elders and youth traveled to Alaska to meet with the descendants of those who had attended this potlatch. And it was this trip that instigated the beginning of the process of the Han songs and dances coming back to the community and being relearned. And over the last decade, many of the songs have come back in a variety of forms. Sometimes they were taught in their entirety, and other times they were pieced together through collaboration of elders who had sort of fragments of songs in their memories. And these songs continue to have huge significance outside just the realm of performance. So for Chontakwitchin, as for many Indigenous Arctic communities, music is profoundly linked to cultural revitalization via language, subsistence practices, self-governance, sovereignty, land rights, and so many more matters of urgency. And I think Peter's presentation showed us that really nicely. So engaging with or even being aware of musical practices can be really critical for researchers with an interest in cultural revitalization, because music is very often the site of such movements, and it illuminates so many other critical aspects of life in these communities. So my hope is that the story of the Han songs can demonstrate how we as researchers have opportunities and responsibilities to engage with and bolster existing local movements of cultural revitalization, because in doing so, we can play a part in telling a different story about these communities, not a story of kind of a passive subjection to these external forces of colonialism, but a story about active and powerful resistance and resilience. So I'd just like to finish with a short reflection on my experience with just that, wherein by kind of enmeshing myself within the movements that were ongoing in the Trontequichin community, and by working within the Heritage Department, I was able to play a small role in their efforts to revitalize and regain some of what, as they say in the Trontequichin community, has not been lost, but has been sleeping. So the Salmon Song is a song that was composed in 2012 by the local singing group, the Han Singers. And this was the first new Han song written in over a century. And it was written in response to declining king salmon runs in the Yukon River. So Trontequichin took action by voluntarily foregoing their rights to subsistence fishing in order to help the salmon stocks replenish. But this song was a way to maintain that relationship in order to sort of ensure that the people and the salmon didn't forget about each other. So this use of singing as a means of communicating with the land and with its inhabitants was a key aspect of my research. And this was a practice that was undertaken in a formal group context, as with the Salmon Song, but also on a personal level by Trontequichin citizens out on the land, hunting, fishing, gathering on their own. So a young Trontequichin citizen called Allison, who I became friends with over the course of my time in Dawson, told me many times about the songs that she wrote while moose hunting. So one, for example, was a song that came to her following a successful harvest, and she had forgotten to bring an offering to leave for her moose, which is the practice within traditional Trontequichin law. So she sang her moose's song to say thank you instead. And Allison gave me the great privilege of allowing me to collaborate with her in making recordings of her drumming and singing several of her songs, including this moose song, which we've now deposited in the Trontequichin Heritage Collections. And these songs embody not only the strength and the resilience of Trontequichin generations, but they also hold these windows into Trontequichin relationships with the land, into their fights to revitalize their language and their culture. And by looking a little bit closer at some of these musical practices and musical histories in these small Arctic communities, we can help to bolster these movements and to tell the stories of people's struggles to reclaim their cultural strength and their cultural health, having fought so hard to protect and maintain what they could in the face of great resistance over the last few centuries. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tamara. That was fascinating. I'll now call on Professor Peter Reid, Professor of Librarianship at Robert Gordon University.
Thank you very much, David. Can someone let me know if you can see that okay?
Looks good. Yes,
okay.
It's fine.
Super. Thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak this morning. I'm going to talk about a project that we're currently leading at Robert Gordon University called Northward. Its official name is Story Tagging, but Northward is the branding and marketing name that we'll be using throughout it. So I'll stick with that today. This is a project that's funded as part of the Northern Periphery and Arctic Programme. We're looking at culture and heritage, I guess, and storytelling with a twist connected with digital technologies, which has already been alluded to in the introduction. And what we're trying to do is use them as a vehicle to help support the visibility, the marketing, the reach of creative practitioners working in remote or peripheral areas. So we're not just a cultural heritage project, we're much more about trying to support and sustain creative practitioners and artisans working in these areas. We're a partnership of a number of organisations led by ourselves at RGU, but involving also University of the Highlands and Islands, Causeway Coast in Northern Ireland, University of Ulster, and then in Scandinavia or the Nordic regions, we have Region Västerbotten in Sweden, the Kvarken municipality, which is a Swedish-speaking municipality on the Gulf of Bothnia in Finland, and Kenozero National Park in Russia. So those are our partners. I'll primarily be talking about the work that we are doing at Robert Gordon and the work that I've been involved in the last 9 months. The project has 5 different work packages. I've highlighted 4 of them there. The 5th is obviously the communication and dissemination package. One is connected with creating a digital platform that will help support these creative practitioners in northern communities. The second is the story collecting part. The third is the creative commissions working with these artisans and practitioners in the north. And it's those 2 elements in the middle that I'll talk more about in the succeeding slides. And then the final work package is really bringing together all of the preceding elements, the platform, the stories, and the creatives to develop something that is sustainable and long-lasting and durable to support those creative practitioners, their work, their marketing, and their sales. It's really the story collecting part that I've been most particularly involved in, because that's the area that I'm interested in and have done work in the past, particularly links between Scotland and Norway. At the heart of it, my colleague Rachel Ironside and I believe fundamentally that stories are just wonderful things. They are wonderful ways to communicate our past and to help us help inform our understanding of the present. They interest us, they inspire us, they enchant us, they tell us about who we are, the environment that we live in. In the part that I'm looking at, we're covering part of the Highlands and Islands, the Murray Firth Basin, and the Northern Isles. And that's the focus of the story collecting process that we've been going through in the last 6 months. And it's been a fascinating experience. One of the things that I think has been revealing to us, and one of the lessons that I think we've learned, is that methods really matter in this. And there's been a lot of discussion across the partners about the working methods for collecting stories. What might work in Scotland doesn't necessarily work in Finland or Russia, and so on. So we've all developed our own methods of working, and these are some of the guidelines and tips and methods that we've put together for the ones that we've collected at RGU. Each partner is tasked with collecting 30 stories. I think we're probably nearer 45 that we've gathered. They come in all shapes and sizes: legend, folklore, historical events, in language and dialect. And I've been interested to hear about the revitalization of language that's been mentioned already, because that's something that's been very evident in the things that we've been looking at. We've been very open-minded in terms of hearing from communities, working with organizations, heritage groups, museums, archives, individuals in the areas that we're all tasked with collecting stories. And we've been, as I say, incredibly open-minded about what a story is and what it means. Just before Christmas, we ran an online workshop called Yule and Clootie Dumplings, and we used Christmas and Hogmanay as the focus for that. And we used it as a story collecting method, and it was incredibly successful. We had about 35 participants. We got a good number of stories. Inevitably, the original plan was for these to be actual face-to-face events, but circumstances obviously precluded that. So we've had to adapt as we've gone on. We've, as I say, collected around 45 stories, and we will make selections to move forward with our partners as we move into the next phase of it. Some incredibly interesting stories, lots that I'd never heard before, and often things that have highlighted links across the northern region. This guising story from Halloween up in Shetland has strong links to the Faroes, to Iceland, to parts of Norway as well. And all of that has been extremely interesting. So it's been really rewarding to do this. I think at the heart of it, the most important thing is that the partners have worked together with their communities. They know them best, they have engaged with them. We've used a variety of different formats. As I mentioned earlier, the importance of the common principles around data collection has been significant, but we've had pragmatic variation in that, so that there's been flexibility around particular cultural sensitivities in the region, and indeed language has been a fairly significant part of that. The next phase is this engaging with creative practitioners, and I'll just say very briefly a little about that. We're in the process of about to start a commissioning process whereby various creative practitioners and artisans will be able to apply for small grants to develop new products inspired by these stories. Eventually, this will all become a bank of stories on which can be drawn on, and a marketing platform for these businesses. So this is revitalization, perhaps in a slightly different context. And just finally, in that, I think we're looking really with some interest at how these creative practitioners and artisan producers will engage with this, how they will take the stories of their area of legend, of folklore, people, places, landscape, whatever, and translate that into a commission as part of the project. In this, and I suppose this is connected with the issue of working with partners in different regions and countries, there's obviously been lots of very practical issues that we've had to iron out about submitting tenders and copyright and so on, and that's been important to work through. But the final message is there has been such real enthusiasm across the partner areas, with the community organisations, with the heritage groups, with the creative practitioners, and ultimately, I think we're going to come out with something that is incredibly durable and has legacy beyond the life of the project. So that's a very short overview of Northward and what we've been doing. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. I'll now turn the floor over to Donna Heddle, please, Director of the Institute of Northern Studies at the University of Highlands and Islands. Okay, you still have your mute on, Donna.
Hello, David. I'm just wondering if you can see my slides as yet.
I can see the slides. It's in the edit view,
Yeah.
but that's fine. We can see it fine. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There we go. You should be able to see me now.
Yep.
That's great. And you can see me on the video as well. I'm having a slight problem with my system here at the moment, but I am getting there.
Looks good.
Go that way. Sorry, I'm just having a slight fankle with this. Good old Scottish word there. Right. Aha, there we go. Well, Martinva Holudunya, it's lovely to be asked along today to talk about CAFE, which is the Circumpolar Archives, Folklore and Ethnography Network. It's a thematic network for the University of the Arctic, which focuses upon how archival collections, ethnographic fieldwork and study of folklore enrich the representation of and communications across the circumpolar region and its peoples. And its main focus is really looking at things like digitizations of manuscripts, photographs, that sort of thing, sound recordings, material objects, everything really that tells us the story of the North. And we're also very interested in improving access to collections and making it possible to share collections with host communities and so on. Our research is really looking at examining best practices of digital sharing and the ethical questions that these technologies pose. We're very interested in looking at creating a forum for discussing the roles of these archives in cultural revival, as well as collaborating to create innovative ways for archival materials to reach wider audiences. And of course, with changes in technology, we're very happily in a position to do just that. As you can see there, you can see the members that we have there, international members, the Polar Libraries, Cullequay, Scotland, the University of Aberdeen, which leads the network, the University of the Highlands and Islands, Norway, UIT, the Arctic University of Norway there, the Faroe Islands, the University of the Faroe Islands, Russian Federation, Northern Arctic Federal University, and so on. Colleagues in Finland, Sweden, Iceland, and the United States of America join us too. So we're quite an extensive network. And how did we start? Well, I suppose really the first thing was the, move to the next slide, if I can, there we are. There's the Turku network meeting on the 6th of May 2018. That was the first network meeting, and we discussed making a formal application to the University of the Arctic to become a thematic network. And we also identified various opportunities for future conferences and meetings and so on. We then had another meeting on the 6th of April 2019 in Santiago de Compostela. And excitingly, at the Stockholm University of the Arctic meeting on the 19th of September, our network was actually approved. So there we are, having it approved there. So what is it that we're actually doing then? Well, one thing that's been very interesting in the past year or so with the advent of COVID is the chance to reflect on our practices. What we're dealing with are quite fragile things, and Peter and David have said about this earlier too. We're dealing with fragile things, narratives, folklore, and so on. They're a bit like footprints in the snow. They're fragile and easily lost if they're not preserved in the right way. So over this period of time, we've asked ourselves lots of questions about how we gather and collect these narratives and folklores, for example. We've asked ourselves quite simple questions. What is a story? Who tells a story? And who owns them? Where are stories? How can we find them? And how should stories be shared? And one of the most important things is the actual collecting and curation of stories. And it's important to consider, when we reflect on this, our own agendas. It's important to consider how the presentation of a collection of stories can be influenced by the values and ideologies of the curator, for example. And the way a collection of stories is curated can also shape the way that these stories and information are used. And as such, an archive of stories doesn't just create knowledge, it shapes knowledge. E.g. women's stories not being represented fully because of systematic exclusion from archives shapes the way that history and women's stories from the past are told. So an important question to ask, and it also touches on what was said earlier about Indigenous languages, is whose stories get told and whose voices get left out. And personally, I'm very encouraged by the use of dialects and Indigenous languages to collect stories in their original form. And of course, our network's all about digitisation. So what are the values of the digitisation process then? Well, physical archives have space constraints. That's quite an obvious remark to make, but digital archives may help to alleviate some of these issues, but it shouldn't be forgotten that they can also be limited by material constraint, such as server space, the time of the curator, the size of the metadata on it. And of course, it's also important to articulate whose stories are being told. It's also important to consider how story archives can be made findable. How do you know they're there? How can you make them accessible? How can you reach the people that you want to reach? You've got a range of audiences that you need to reach. And this requires consideration of the metadata associated with story archives. Again, we need to consider the curator's bias and ideology in relation to how metadata is formed. And of course, written and audio presentation of stories differs. Written is not the same as audio. It's slower and tends to be filtered to a greater extent in terms of curation. And oral stories tend to be quicker and are defined by the way they are spoken, the tropes, the traditions, and the language. So the format of a story can influence the way it's told. How stories will be formatted is an important aspect to consider, and we have to give thought to how we can do that. And digitization does allow us to look at different forms of collecting stories. They can be visual, they can be oral, they can be written, they can be all sorts of things. And in the West, written stories tend to be prioritised and can be more sustainable than audio or visual. However, the sustainability of oral storytelling is important and should also be considered. In particular, cultural consideration is important when thinking about story collection and curation. For instance, imposing written formats on oral traditions may be seen as colonial by some cultures and can therefore have political implications. In addition, not all information can be written down. And can only be shared through visual, audio, or performative means. And I'm thinking here about work I've done myself with herring girls in the north of Iceland, where we record, this is many years ago now, we actually made videos of them. And in many cases, it's what wasn't said and what was hinted at that enriched the actual product that we have. So we have to think about the preservation too. What are we preserving? Who are we to say what should we preserve? Not all cultures and communities and individuals value preservation. So we need to ask if preservation is important and valued. Sometimes it's helpful to forget. And preservation is often seen as an inherently good thing, but some people may not want aspects of the past or their culture preserved. And it's also important to consider with preservation the difference between a library, which is current, and an archive, which is historic. And of course, preservation comes with its own responsibilities and a range of ethical and moral considerations, which are very important to the work of the network, indeed. And the network has produced a vast amount of journals and materials and so on in this short period of time that it's really been existing. It's been most impressive range of work, and I urge you to have a look at the page on the University of Aberdeen if you'd like to find more about it. But when it comes to Scotland and the Arctic, we think about the relationships that we have and the future relationships that we can have for research. I'm sitting here in Orkney, and the Northern Isles, of course, have a historically long relationship with the Arctic. We have the stories of the Finn folk, for example, who are clearly Inuit, coming in their skin-covered canoes down to the Northern Isles, wearing the clothes that they're wearing and so on. That's a strong strand in the folklore of Orkney and Shetland. But we also, Orkney is the last place to get fresh water on the way to the Arctic. It was the last staging post for many expeditions to the Arctic. So we have these strong historical connections, but we also have connections to do with Arctic sea passages in the modern day, to do with links to the Arctic, and of course with whaling as well in the Arctic. So that's our past, but what can our future be? Well, I think our future can be very much about taking stories and the material that we work on in the Cafe Network and making it into a valuable and sustainable resource for communities to revitalise them and give them ownership. And we're just working at INS on a project at the moment looking at museums and how they deal with Sami culture and how they present that and how we can represent that, if I can use the word there, in a better way that more accurately reflects how the Sami see their own culture. And I think that's the way forward for research between Scotland and the Arctic. It's a very comparative thing in point of fact, and I think it's something that will be incredibly valuable in the future. And also, I think that we find ourselves in this strange new world, but there are opportunities there. There's still opportunities to preserve the footprints in the snow. And finally, at the end of the day, we're really asking ourselves the question, what is North? And I'd like to finish by just showing you the latest book from the Institute for Northern Studies, which has many members from the Cafe Network represented in it. And we ask ourselves the question, what is North? Because at the end of the day, these are the questions that we are asking ourselves. This is what we're all about. What is North? From a point of view of, it could be climate, it could be folklore, it could be well-being, it could be all of these things. But at the end of the day, we seek the North. And in the words of Alfred Lord Tennyson, dark and true and tender is the North. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for an inspiring talk and for introducing your book. So now I guess we'll move on to our facilitated discussion.